Greetings from 104 McGowan here in Monterey College. This is Benjamin Brandenburg, signing in for one very last lecture here in the spring semester of 2020. I have very much missed all of you this spring, and I'm looking forward to seeing many of you in the fall, God willing. This final lecture is a little bit more personal, a little bit more speculative, as well, looking primarily at the world to come. And we'll keep with the theme of sort of world order and these large influences that will organize the decisions you make, the world that you live in. And it's my contention that the world in 2020 is very similar to the world exactly a century ago. In 1919, leaders from Britain, France, Italy, the United States, and other nations came together to formulate a new world order at the Versailles Peace Conference following the cataclysm of the Great War. In these peace talks, President Woodrow Wilson was the all-star. America had arrived at the end of the war, turned the tide of war, and he had a lot of leverage. And he dreamed of a liberal democratic order based on democracy, free trade, and national self-determination. The 14 points that we studied earlier this semester. Unfortunately for Woodrow Wilson and his compatriots, these ideals fell to the wayside as the Great War's principal victors, namely Britain and France, enforced a continued regime of really paternalistic colonialism, what they viewed as sort of a nicer colonialism onto the entire world. At the very same time, Soviet Russia, who was not invited to the peace conference, offered a third option, which was global communism, workers of the world uniting, really quite utopian. And tragically, a decade later, there was a fourth option growing in Italy and Nazi Germany, which attempted to enforce an authoritarian racial empire onto the world. Now, thankfully, after Germany's defeat in World War I, fascism was defeated and British and French-style colonialism was exhausted. The U.S. really stood ascendant, and they created a liberal international order that competed with global communism over the rest of the century. These two versions of modernity fought for the hearts and minds of people all around the world until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Settled really the matter in America's favor. The U.S. vision of freedom, free trade, globalization, and democracy that was forged by Presidents Wilson and later FDR and other post-war presidents really stood ascendant at this time. Indeed, a political philosopher by the name of Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called This is the End of History and the last man standing after the fall of communism, fascism, and constitutional monarchies was liberal democracy. It was really sort of this euphoric moment. George H.W. Bush, then the American president, said this was a new world order. The dream team was doing their thing at the Barcelona Olympics. U2 was putting out albums with lyrics like, "We're one, but we're not the same. We've got to carry each other." McDonald's was ascendant, going throughout nations in Russia and China. This really seemed to be, for a short period, a new world order, almost a utopian end of the world. Unfortunately, even as liberal internationalism, this American world order stood ascendant, the last 3 years have experienced a world filled with mixed prosperity. We've seen the rise of the internet, but we've also seen recessions, like in 2008, the Great Recession, right? We've seen some stability and prosperity, but we've also seen genocides in places like Rwanda and Darfur and Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've seen the rise of terrorism, right? Osama bin Laden, ISIS, and others who want to bring the world back to the 7th century. So this is a world in which history has returned, conflict has returned, And the post-Cold War order never really materialized in ways that George H.W. Bush and perhaps Ronald Reagan hoped it would be. And in 2020, we have a situation that's very similar to 2019, in which there are these competing visions for the way the world should work, for world order. So for the rest of this lecture, we'll look at these three stories. We'll look at the rise of China and their version of authoritarian capitalism, which they've made work. We'll look at the new nationalism, best exemplified by the American president, Donald Trump. And we'll look at whether this post-war internationalism still has any purchase. Here, we'll look at the story of Germany and Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, who in many ways is leading the charge for this revived internationalism. So first up in these competing visions for world order is China. Now, the leader of China is a gentleman named Xi Jinping. You can see him here in the slide. He is presented as very modern. Behind him, he's got the history of China, the Berlin Wall. He's also a communist, right? He's the leader of the card-carrying Communist Party, which is the only party that is allowed in China. And when he came to power, he began to put forward a speech that he pulls out every once in a while. One of your source documents has a version of the speech from 2015, which he calls the Chinese Dream Speech. In short, he rather cheekily suggests the American dream is alive and well, not in Baltimore, but in Beijing. The Chinese dream, quote, is a dream of the people. We can fulfill the Chinese dream only when we link it with our people's yearning for a better life. So he's co-opting very sort of American ideals of the good life, and saying we're actually offering that for nations around the world. Indeed, it's no secret that China has perhaps the world's largest economy, is the world's number 2 superpower, and this is really a surprise, right? This raises a series of questions. How did the land once commonly and with some disdain known to the West as communist China come to lead the world in the number of homeowners, internet users, college graduates, and by some counts, billionaires? How did this once cloistered nation with a flailing economy drive extreme poverty down to less than 1%? How did it achieve social economic mobility and rival by much of the world? How did a country that rejected, goodness, all of the conventional wisdom of Western economists get to a place where it's on track to surpass the American economy within a number of years? This is a question I want to sort of investigate, right? And we really should note, and this is really a surprise because China today is largely unrecognizable to the founders of the People's Republic of China, to Mao Zedong and those early communists who believed you had to suffer together for a better, more radiant future. In China, there's tons and tons of upward mobility. As Xi Jinping talks about, while China's still poorer than America overall, it's outpaced its Western rivals in many crucial areas. Its population is among the most optimistic in the world, according to public opinion surveys. 800 million people have risen out of poverty since the 1990s. Incomes are rising across generations, with children out-earning their parents, something we are not quite seeing in the United States, especially in these post-COVID times. But back to China, life expectancy has soared. These folks are as obsessed with Disney and Marvel Cinematic Universes as much as people in the United States are. This is really something that's quite unprecedented. So how did this happen, right? Because when we last talked about China, we were talking about the Great Leap Forward in the 1950s and 60s, where upwards of 30 to 40 million people suffered from unnecessary deaths due to starvation and violence and persecution, right? How did China achieve this? Tremendous success. So that's what I want to try to answer in the next few minutes. And the origins of it go back to a big surprise. In the 1970s, the Soviets were in the middle of a cultural revolution. The Chinese communists were in the middle of their cultural revolution, which was really extreme. This is a period of persecution against Christians, professors, intellectuals, and they actually thought that the Soviets were not firm enough in their communism. And there was a wedge growing between Chinese communists and Soviet communists. In the middle of this, they sought new friends, including the United States. So at a ping pong tournament in Japan in 1971, the Chinese, who, it's no surprise, are very, very, very talented at this sport of what was once called wiffle waffle, invented by drunken Brits on a dining table way back in the 1870s. At this ping pong tournament, they let the Americans win. And the American players were like, what is going on here? I should be destroyed by these people. So after the American victory at the ping pong tournament, the ping pong player gave them a diplomatic message saying, our government would like to talk to your government. So before he knew it, the Secretary of State were talking to each other, and eventually, in a huge shock, America's Republican Cold War warrior, tricky Dick Nixon, shortly before his infamous downfall, traveled to China, and he met with his counterpart, Mao Zedong. They ate together. They talked about a new future together. They didn't set in any grandiose terms, but they began to recognize each other. A few years later, Mao Zedong passed from the scene. Nixon was living in disgrace. Successors kept up the relationship. Jimmy Carter invited Mao Zedong's successor, Deng Xiaoping, to visit America. He comes to America in 1979. They do rodeo together, and he says, you know what? Maybe we can have a few American factories begin to open up in China. But this didn't really happen for a few more years because of red tape, because communists have a command economy. They're still suspicious of America. But something remarkable happened in the year 1984. In 1984, there was a very boring conference in the middle of the country in a mountainside resort. The conference was titled A Symposium of Middle-Aged and Young Economists. A very communist-sounding symposium. But what they did here, they invited a number of young economists and said, hey, without any risk to you, try to come up with some ideas of how we can remain communist and improve our economy, which at the time was still in shambles. So these young economists probably naively begin to think outside the box. And one of them, named Zhu Yingyang, who's now retired, said to himself, as we were discussing the problem, I was thinking, how do we make this work? And he eventually said, what if we have all the state factories, right, in China, as in all communist countries, the state owned all the factories at the time. What if we have these factories meet the official quotas for production, but after they meet their quota, they can sell anything extra at a price they choose? And you know what? If they want to make other stuff, they can do that too. It was ultimately a really clever and quietly radical proposal to undercut China's planned economy. In addition to this, they said, what if we let some people privatize their land? It'll help raise income for farmers. What if we let some small private businesses begin to open, especially in these special economic zones that would be centered around the city Shanghai? What if we let more foreigners open factories, hotels, and other businesses? And they could have put this forward, and all these ideas could have been shut down. These young economists, most of these guys are just out of college, out of grad school. They could have been sent to jail. This is what would have happened to intellectuals in China in the 70s and 60s and 50s before them. But the regime of Deng Xiaoping says, you know what? Let's go for it. And before you know it, the quotas that these guys had put on factories eventually went down to like 5%. So you have these huge state factories that only have to do 5% of the stuff, and for the rest of the time, they get to do whatever they want to do. And what results is the Chinese becoming a manufacturing powerhouse, to the point where today they're not just making cheap stuff at the dollar spot. they're making everything in-house. I just purchased, with some moral qualms, a Roku television from Target. I'm very happy with, even though I wish I had the wealth to purchase a Sony or some kind of made-in-America TV. It's very high-end. They produce some great products at, of course, a pretty good price. And this has been their path to an economic miracle in the 1980s and 1990s. They've grown to such great strength that they're beginning to export this Chinese dream to the rest of the world. Their government talks about rebuilding the Silk Road. They call this the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're investing in infrastructure really to reach the entire world. From Cambodia to South Africa, they've been funding major infrastructure like building dams, bridges, ports, power plants. Here they are in Egypt, building hotels and universities. Some have described this as a modern-day Marshall Plan. If you recall, that was America's plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. And they're calling it the Belt and Road Initiative. It's bolder, it's more riskier than the Marshall Plan, it's more expensive by a large degree, and they're attempting to win allies and develop new markets. Right on this slide, you can see China is behind the financing and the construction of a dam that will bring more energy to Cambodia. Right here we have the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka. Right, a power station in South Africa, a soccer stadium in Zambia. Right, they're involved in building projects in over 196 countries throughout the world. Right. Now, it's possible that Beijing is using its infrastructure investments to ensnare partners and debt traps and then seize their assets. We still don't know how this is quite going to work out. But this is an amazing, ambitious project. China's investing the world in the way America did about 100 years ago. Right? They're really making a play for global leadership. And for nations in Africa and around China in Southeast Asia, they're looking towards China's leadership, even if they might not like its one-party communist government. Right here, you can see a map of all the nations around the world that are involved in China's Belt and Road Initiative, including, as you can see, a few building projects in the United States. Now, this has come with some pushback, right? While China is on track to become the largest economy, we'll see how this plays out post-COVID. Things may be changing in the future for them. But on this map here, you can see they're projected to surpass the United States by the year 2030. And they're beginning to put pressure. You may recall last year there were human rights protests in the city of Hong Kong, which has sort of semi-independent status for complicated reasons within mainland China. Now, the Chinese love the sport of basketball. They had a great player, a great center named Yao Ming, who was a center for the Houston Rockets for many years. They love basketball. And head of the Houston Rockets, the general manager, had a tweet, just a gentle tweet in which he supported the pro-democracy protests that were going on and still are going on in Hong Kong. And they basically got the NBA to put pressure on this Rockets manager. He deleted the tweet. All the NBA players, including personal heroes of mine like LeBron James, were saying things like, "Oh, we have to be delicate in this situation," and so forth and so forth. So they have a lot of power over industry. You may recall, even in Hollywood, right? When's the last time you've seen a Hollywood film with a Chinese character as the main villain? Right? During the Cold War, we had a whole bunch of movies with the Russians as the bad guys. Usually when there's a lot of economic tension with the country that currently exists with China, you'd expect there to be a lot more animosity. Part of this is because just about half of big blockbuster movies' budgets are earned back in the growing Chinese public sector. But all this comes, of course, at a cost, right? China remains an authoritarian communist state. They've been able to make authoritarian capitalism work. So they've proved that you can have intense state control and enforcement of how you do capitalism. And it's been nearly a miracle in many ways, but they've done this at great cost, right? They've continued to silence and control much of their population, right? In Chinese education, there's still a strong focus on rote memorization. As you can see, this class here is conducting memorization techniques, right? In their history textbooks, young Chinese students don't grow up learning about the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, which occurred in the summer of 1989, right at the time the Iron Curtain was about to fall. Freedom was in the air. Students were protesting for democracy in Beijing. Here you can see an iconic image of one man holding back 4 tanks from gunning down the protesters, saving many, many lives in the process. We still don't know his identity to this date, actually. But nobody in China knows about this. It's withheld from them, right? So there's great silencing, a lot of control, information. Even today, there is a spreading of rumors that COVID-19 began as a CIA plot to throw shade at China. They've also done this by controlling the internet. Right? China has essentially created so it's a closed internet. Facebook, Google, Twitter are all illegal in China, but they've created their own versions. You don't search Google in China, you search Baidu. You don't go on YouTube, you go on Youku. You don't do Instagram, you go Douyin, right? You do Didi instead of Uber, continuous and so on. And these companies have become enormously powerful and wealthy. I believe 3 or 4 of the 10 wealthiest companies, internet companies, are based in China. Right? They're using facial recognition to really amazing, in an evil sense, I guess, ways, right, to track their society. Young people are, when they can't, you can still date who you want to date, but there's a lot of pressure to date within your sort of class. So you're giving, on dating apps, you're given sort of a score of how loyal you are to the regime that is tied to your credit score and your sort of financial forecast, right? So it's a lot about wealth and loyalty here in China. They've done this by controlling dissidents. Human rights activists have been imprisoned. Artists have been imprisoned or sent away from the country. Many of these dissidents, I should say, happen to be Christians. Christianity is booming in China. There are between 70 and 200 million Christians in a nation of 1.5 billion people. It's very fast growing among both the nation's elite and the very poor. So it's very possible that China will be a Christian nation by the year 2050. We will see how this turns out. Of course, China's push to exert its influence throughout the world to create a new world order has been hampered immensely by the outbreak of COVID-19, which by all accounts emerged on an animal wet market in the city of Wuhan in central China. Indeed, the silencing has gone so far as they even silenced the first whistleblower, a doctor named Li Wenliang, pictured here in this slide, who was trying to say, this is very serious. We need to be closing the city, closing the state. Tragically, he died of COVID at the age of 34. All right. So China is, we may not get the sense of it here, but they're really making a play for sort of global leadership, cheekily throwing around the phrase, the American dream is alive in China. All right. Now, another player in this sort of world order game is this idea of sort of revived or new nationalism, right? Now we have this ideology coming to power with the election of President Donald Trump. I don't want to stay here too long, but President Trump, a Republican, won the election in 2016 by going against sort of established Republican norms. He criticized foreign interventionism, like the wars in Iraq. He criticized some of the neoliberal order and deregulation. He criticized how big companies are sending jobs to places like China and Mexico and elsewhere. In many ways, he was doing things that were very similar to Bernie Sanders, who was doing some of the same critique from the left. So these ideas had a lot of purchase that helped him win the election, along with America's unique system of the Electoral College, whereby he was able to achieve victory while having a minority national vote. He also was able to achieve victory because he ran against a relatively weak Democratic opponent, who probably overemphasized her technocratic skills, and a candidate who neglected to talk about religion, as opposed to Donald Trump, who said he would protect religious conservatives. Indeed, 81% of Americans supported Donald Trump, the highest in American history. And when he was elected, on Inauguration Day, on January 20th, and you'll read some of this in your source document for this week, he gave a speech that was called the American First speech. Now, I do need to say I was very surprised by the language of America First. Historically speaking, it's undeniable that America First was a political slogan that was put forward by Charles Lindbergh, right? The famous 1920s and 1930s hero aviator. But that was also the organization that painted Nazi Germany as a potential ally, and an organization that suggested we should not go into the war for Britain and for France against Nazi Germany. Obviously, really complicated phrasing. I believe the Trump administration thought that most Americans would have forgotten the original use of this term. Now, thankfully, in the 1940s, this movement died out after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and Germany declaring war against the United States. But you should know this background. Now, it's perhaps too early to really try to put some sense into what America First as sort of a worldview means. But I'm going to attempt, at great risk, to do so. This is a philosophy that is really ardent nationalistic. Now, earlier this semester, we talked about nationalism in the 1900s, right? This was a philosophy that saw a great competition between nations. And being a nationalist means being your country over and against other countries. So this is a worldview that seeks different nations in intense, self-interested competition with each other. It's also a philosophy that is very populist in nature. It's very critical of the last 30 years of globalization, right? I would argue that both Democrats and Republicans in the post-Cold War era, so George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, they're all very much in line with globalization, and that it would be good for the American worker and for the world. But as jobs moved overseas, a lot of towns suffered, right? And this was an attempt to turn that tide to some degree. This is a philosophy that opposed interventionism, right? This is a philosophy that opposed this idea that America should be the world's policeman, getting involved in intervention like places like Somalia and Libya and Iraq and so forth. Now, you can question whether Trump has been a populist His tax cut certainly was very neoliberal in its framing. You can question whether Trump's been true to his anti-interventionist positions. Right, America almost went to war with the nation of Iran in January of this year. But this is sort of the idea of the philosophy. It's also opposed to immigration. I don't want to, this is not the place to stick too long to his language on Mexicans or people from Africa or Muslim people. But his rhetoric is, as a whole, very opposed to immigration. Indeed, yesterday he banned all immigration to the United States in light of the coronavirus, perhaps using this as an opportunity to do so. This is also an ideology that sort of casts doubt and opposes multilateral organizations. So here we're talking about all those organizations that America helped birth in the aftermath of World War II, like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, international law, NATO. You get the drift, right? This is very much a return to sort of 19th century power politics. And it's not too secret I have doubts about this. It should be said that the 19th century was a world in which this sort of ideology, at least for Europeans, proved to be very effective in keeping them at bay. The 19th century, in many ways, was a peaceful and prosperous century in Europe with this sort of framing. And it's also important to note that the rise of Donald Trump is not unique. America is not exceptionalism. There's been a wave of nationalist populists emerging on the scene over the last 15 to 20 years. The American president is merely the latest example of this larger global trend, right? You could look across the Atlantic to America's very close allies, the British, who they have a quote-unquote special relationship with. In England, they voted a few years ago to leave the European Union in a move called Brexit, also as part of this new nationalist trajectory, right? In Hungary, a gentleman named Viktor Orbán is also doing this. Banned all immigration, actually became technically a dictator recently, but that's outside of this framing in many ways. In India, you've had these nationalists like Indira Modi. In Brazil, Bolsonaro. Right? So this is not unique to the United States. Across the world, there's been pushback to globalization, to this. Many people are saying maybe this is not the best thing for the world. Right? This is sort of one solution for going forward in the aftermath of the post-Cold War order. It should be said that Vladimir Putin is sort of the chief architect of how this works. He's been in power on and off since the year 2000, head of kind of the resurgent imperialist state of Russia. And he sort of set the example of how to achieve power and success. He has a very high approval rating within the state of Russia. Very likely will be president for life. All right. I may be speaking over myself here as I move forward through the slide. The third case is the story of Angela Merkel, who's revived this vision of America's post-war liberal order, what I'm calling liberal internationalism. She's the one defending the World Health Organization, the UN, European Union, cooperation, these lofty ideas of peace and prosperity and so forth. And her trajectory is really quite fascinating. Angela Merkel was born in 1954. She was born in communist East Germany, then under the protection and guidance of the Soviet Union. Her father was a Lutheran pastor, so she was a PK, a pastor's kid. And her, there was some mild persecution as she's growing up in this closed society. She's a smart kid. She goes into science. She's a scientist. She earns a PhD from the University of Leipzig in physical chemistry in 1986. So what can you do with a science degree? You can become, the most powerful politician of the last 15 years. All right. So when Germany is unified, when the Cold War ends in 1990, she is very young. She's elected to parliament. She's fast-tracked to leadership. In 1994, she becomes the Minister of the Environment. And by the year 2000, she becomes the head of a party that I want to dwell on for just a moment. She becomes the head of a party called the Christian Democratic Union, or the CDU. This is a party that goes back to the 1800s, but really it was the CDU in its German and French and Italian forms that rebuilt Europe in the aftermath of World War II. This is a party that has four platforms. One is fierce anti-communism, which is why America supported it intensely. Two, the inherent dignity of the human person. This is a party that is pro-life, pro-family. Three, this is a party that wasn't afraid to critique capitalism. They said, we need a welfare state. Otherwise, we'll get something like communism. We need to take care of our people in this post-war environment. We need the state to have charity for the poor. These are coming from explicitly Christian frames of understanding. And fourth, there was resolute internationalism. They bought big into these ideas of the UN, of the European Union, of these ideas of the human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written by Christian Democrats of the 1950s. And I mention this because this party doesn't exist in the United States, right? You don't have a party that is firmly pro-family, pro-life, and firmly like pro-big government welfare state, which is really quite fascinating. It does exist in Germany, and its leader is Angela Merkel. She was elected in 2005, and she's now in her fourth and final term as Chancellor of Germany. And she's been the leader of Germany, and they've done really well economically in the last 15, 20 years. And she's been sort of the chief defender in many ways of this idea of liberal internationalism. Here's the definition from Britannica. It is the belief that international progress is possible where progress is defined as a movement toward increased levels of harmonious cooperation between political communities. All right, this might sound kind of pie in the sky, but this was very dominant in post-war America. This was the ideology of President Eisenhower, of JFK, of Barack Obama, etc. And during the years in office, she was able to do a few big things in Germany. She was able to cut government spending, right? She's part of a conservative party, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union. And she was also at the very same time able to reduce employment, as you can see in these two charts. And in 2008, Europe went through this huge recession. Like the United States, the Greek economy was especially doing bad. They were part of the European Union. And she basically bossed Greece around, saying they have to cut government spending. They have to go under intense austerity. A lot of people view this as really quite intense bullying. You saw a lot of images of Angela Merkel with a Hitler-like stash in propaganda and so forth. But she really holds the European Union together during the last 15 years. And she went through another crisis in 2015. Indeed, this was a global crisis. Background. In 2011, in the Middle East, there was a movement called the Arab Spring. This was a Twitter and Facebook-led movement where young people wanted more democracy in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. And except for the case of Tunisia and to a lesser extent Egypt, all these movements were squashed down. And they were especially squashed down in the nation of Syria. Out of Damascus, this gentleman named Bashar al-Assad used this as an excuse to go after all of his enemies. And in the process, a civil war emerged. And all of a sudden, you have 20 million people seeking to escape the country. Now, some became refugees in neighboring Syria and Turkey, but many of them attempted to push into Europe. In the summer of 2015, nearly 1,000 people a day were dying on illegal border crossings, drowning out in the open sea. And people were questioning, what should we do? Should we allow some of them to come in? There's too many of them. What should we do? There's no easy solutions. In Germany, Angela Merkel did something remarkable. She said, we can do this. She opened up a Willkommenskultur. She said, wir schaffen das. We can do this. Let's welcome these immigrants. And she did so for explicitly sort of compassionate, conservative Christian reasons. She eventually lets in over 1.2 million Syrian Arab refugees. When people criticized her, she said this: we have the opportunity and the freedom to have our religion, to practice it and to believe in it. I would like to see more people who have the courage to say, I'm a Christian believer, have the courage to enter into dialogue with our Arab guests. Fear, she said, was never a good advisor. Cultures that are marked by fear will not conquer their future, right? So for these attempts, she was called Mutter Angela. Here you can see her in a German magazine, kind of memorialized as Angela Merkel, right? In soccer stadiums. Here you can see an image of the very popular hipster soccer club Borussia Dortmund, for whom a young American superstar, Christian Pulisic, played for a number of years. Germans put a banner saying, refugees, welcome. The Germans attempted to make it when no other nation could. They allowed 1.2 million refugees into their country. Now, it wasn't always easy, and it hasn't always been easy, but by and large, Germany has achieved success in this project. Many of the Christian churches have gotten involved there. Right here, you can see a pastor, an evangelical pastor, a friend of mine, putting up this sign of the common. And there's actually been a surge of Arabs going to evangelical and other Christian church communities, perhaps out of a desire to achieve citizenship, but for some of them, there's been a real authentic turn towards Jesus. I would suggest that this is the bravest political act in my lifetime of any political leader in the world. So, it's 2020. We're all trying to figure out what's going to happen. I have no idea. Historians only look to the past. But I do think we have these three ideas that are going to be vying for influence. Maybe they'll be vying for a long time, but China will still attempt to remake the world in its image, with authoritarian capitalism taking the lead. Nationalism in America may doubt if the president loses re-election, but it certainly will remain popular in other places around the world, especially Brazil and, of course, Russia and other nations. And we'll see if this idea that came out of America after World War II, this liberal internationalism, which is currently being led by the nation of Germany and Angela Merkel, will be successful. Early signs indicate that there is still hope for liberal internationalism. Germany, of Western nations, has had so far the best response to the coronavirus. It helps to have a leader who's a scientist run that effort. But we can all pray, we can all hope, we can all pray for human flourishing in the future, even if we have different visions of how that vision of flourishing should be achieved. All right, I've chatted too much. I wish you a great summer. I wish you a happy final. Godspeed, everyone.